Hello, my name is Daniel, and in the production you're about to see, I'll be telling you the story of my grandfather Jack Finley through his own words. Jack will be guiding the process from behind the camera. In doing so, we'll also be telling you the story of Jack's uncle, who was also named Jack Finley. So without further ado, we present the man from Tullamore.
Patrick Kavanagh believed that the smallest event in the smallest parish in Ireland could be worthy of an epic tale. We go through our daily lives blissfully unaware of the millions of stories and experiences going on around us. But when we look into our past, into our family's past, we realise that local and national history are never very far away from each other. This is just one such story from my family's history that links two generations with one lonely road in County Offaly. It is a story of a man who fought for his country. It is a story of local links and a local legacy. It is a story of crime and punishment and of sporting success. It is a search for the epic in my family's past. The well-known song goes, "It started with a kiss." My story starts as a young boy growing up here on Dillon Street in Tullamore in the 1940s. I remember a trinket containing a small newspaper cutting from a local newspaper in Tipperary. The article concerns a feis and sport held in a field at the Dundrum Hotel. The article also mentions the Crummy family from Ballydine who took part in the Irish dancing there. On the opposite side of this article is a short report with the headline, "Shooting near Birr." Brothers Charles and Peter Molloy and Michael Coyne were charged in Birr Court in 1923 in connection with the shooting of John Finlay of Tullamore. So what's so unusual about this newspaper clipping from 1923? Well, my mother was one of the Crummy family who were mentioned in the article. And years later she would move to Tullamore and begin to work for T. English & Company. There she would meet Thomas Finlay, who was the brother of John Finlay, and they would get married 10 years later. What a coincidence then that this small newspaper clipping would play such an important role in my family's history some 89 years later. My father never spoke about the Civil War, but he and his family were staunch Republicans. I also knew that my uncle Jack, as he was known, worked for D.E. Williams's in Tullamore. His job entailed delivering goods by horse and cart to different shops owned by the company throughout the Midlands. He'd been working for the company for the last 8 years. He left Tullamore about 10:30 on the morning of Monday the 12th of February 1923 with a cargo of provisions for their shops in Clara, Ballycumber and Ferban. He arrived here in Ballycumber shortly after 2 p.m. and after making his delivery to the branch house here and to Flynn's public house, he continued on the road to Ferban. The story goes that as he was travelling along the road near Lemanaghan, he was stopped by 3 men who halted him. One of the men was armed with a rifle. Jack had been robbed before, and his employers made clear that if this happened again, he would be fired. They were concerned that due to his Republican background, he may be handing over some of his load to the local IRA. According to the Midland Tribune of February 17, 1923, Jack Finley was a man of powerful physique, who resisted the raiders, one of whom, seeing they were not likely to succeed in their enterprise, presented the rifle with which he was armed and fired, shooting Jack through the heart. The horse and dray were found on the roadside some distance from the body, nothing having apparently been interfered with. It is thought that when the raiders saw what they had done, they decamped as quickly as they could across the fields, not venturing to interfere with the contents of the dray. The paper continues, "A Mauser rifle cartridge case was found near the scene of the tragedy. The occurrence was reported to the civic guards at Clara, a number of whom proceeded to the scene of the shooting and had the body removed to Ballycumber, where an inquest was held by Dr. William Maher, Ferban. The jury found that the deceased was shot by some person or persons unknown and tendered sympathy to the family." According to the Midland Tribune of February 17, 1923, the remains were conveyed to Tullamore, the home of the deceased, by motor on Tuesday night. His tragic death has cast a gloom over Killy and the district where the deceased was a favourite with all classes. The funeral of young Finlay took place from Killy Church on Wednesday afternoon and was the largest beheld for possibly a century in that neighbourhood. The cortege comprised hundreds of young men and dozens of horse and motor vehicles. There was a big contingent of ex-IRA men from Tullamore, and Wednesday being a half-holiday, a large number of Messrs Williams employees also attended. Mr Whelan, TC, represented the Transport Workers Union. Several members of the Tullamore Urban Council, including Vice Chairman Mr Beryl, were also present. Wreaths were sent from Tullamore ex-IRA men, and from Offaly No. 1 Brigade IRA, to which the deceased belonged, and with whom he took a prominent part in the fight against the British in the years 1920 to 21, being subsequently captured and interned. There was a beautiful wreath from Tullamore GAA Club, which was represented by Messrs Holland, O'Brien, Hogan and Fitzsimons. Several other clubs from throughout the county were also represented, including Killy and Ballycommon. Jack was born here in Tullamore in 1897, one of 11 children, 6 boys and 5 girls. His parents, Patrick and Mary Ellen, were from a well-known farming family in the area. Tullamore is situated about 3 miles from the village of Killy, with its attractive green and its association with 2 great events and a world-famous greyhound. I remember as a young boy in the 1940s and 50s coming here to Killy Sports with my father every August Bank Holiday Monday on our bicycles. This was a great occasion for the village, as it attracted large crowds who came to see some of Ireland's top athletes and cyclists in action. This was also a very special day for people who had moved away from the parish. It offered them an opportunity to return and meet up with friends and relations, have a chat, have a drink, and reminisce about bygone days. Margaret O'Connor Fahey was married to a high-profile nobleman from Offaly. Her family, the O'Carrolls, were associated with Leap Castle, and they ruled over large areas of land, including parts of Offaly, Laois and County Tipperary. Leap Castle, which still stands today, is situated in the townland of Coolderry on the Tipperary border, and over the turbulent centuries has kept watch for the lords of Eli O'Carroll. From here the O'Carrolls prepared for victory and defeat. Here the O'Carrolls brought their brides and their captives. Women such as Margaret were very rare in the 15th century. Most women usually lived restricted and private lives. Margaret, however, combined her love for the arts with a flair for philanthropy and met a real social need at the time. During a time of famine or great need, Margaret organised a massive festival and invited many of the learned people of Ireland to come. They brought their friends, relations and other people in need. The event took place on the 26th of March 1433 here in the village. Margaret also held another festival in Rathangan, County Kildare that year. During this feast over 5,000 people were fed, and the destitute and the poor were given food and money to take home with them. The very Reverend Martin Brophy, who owned the famous racing greyhound Mick the Miller, was born near Paulstown, County Kilkenny. His interest in greyhounds showed itself at first in Baltinglass, County Wicklow, where he owned and coursed a dog named Crom Abu. In 1922, Father Brophy was transferred to Killy, and it was here that the famous Mick the Miller was bred and reared. At the time, Father Brophy had in his employment a Mr. Michael Green, who became one of the most famous trainers of greyhounds. When Mick was born, he was the runt of the litter of 9 pups born on the 29th of June, 1926. For whatever reason, Michael Green decided to rear the wonder dog himself. He fed it with milk out of a mineral water bottle like a pet lamb, left it with his mother at night, but took it to the curate's house by day. He was fed 3 times a day from the bottle, and the other 8 pups were disposed of in the locality. It's interesting to recall just how Mick the Miller got his name. A group of priests were gathered outside Father Brophy's house, and they debated what name they should call the dog. Several names were suggested, but none were accepted. Just at a critical moment in the discussion, a man came on the scene, called Mick Dunn, who owned the mill here in the village. Someone said, "Here's Mick the Miller," and there and then they decided to call the dog by that name. Mick is one of that rare breed of sporting greats who outgrew their own sport and became famous in their own right. He was well known, even by those who knew little about greyhounds. According to the Irish Times, on the 10th of September 1925, Charles Molloy, Peter Molloy and Michael Coyne were all sent forward from Ferban District Court for trial at the next sitting of the High Court Circuit. They were charged with conspiring to kill and killing John Finlay at Leabeg on the road between Ferban and Ballycumber in February 1923. According to the Irish Times, on Tuesday, January 26, 1926, sentence of death was passed on Charles Molloy, aged 21 years, of Kings County by Mr. Justice Sullivan at the Central Criminal Court, Green Street, on Monday, 25th of January 1926. He was found guilty of the murder of John Finlay, a van driver, on the high road between Ballycumber and Ferban in Kings County on the 12th of February 1923. The prisoner's brother, Peter Molloy, aged 19, and Michael Coyne pleaded guilty to attempted robbery on the same occasion, and a nolle prosequi was entered by the state in a charge of murder for which they were to be tried. They were put back for sentence. Mr. Carrigan KC, who prosecuted for the state, said that there was not a single extenuating circumstance to distinguish this case from cold-blooded murder. Finlay was a van driver employed by Messrs. Williams of Tullamore. It was known that he would pass along the road with his horse and van at a certain hour, and the accused man, his brother and Coyne, took up positions in a deserted stable which commanded a view of the road, and there lay in wait for him, their primary object being robbery. The accused man had a loaded rifle. The Irish Times continues, "When Finlay came along with his horse and van, the 3 men appeared on the road, held him up and told him to hand over the goods. He refused and an altercation ensued, during which the accused man levelled his rifle at Finlay and shot him dead. Coyne and Peter Molloy were subsequently tried, and Coyne was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude and Peter Molloy to 6 months imprisonment. The date of execution for Charles Molloy was set for the 24th of February 1926. However, 2 weeks before this, the Governor-General of Ireland commuted his sentence from death to penal servitude for life. On leaving school in 1952, I went to work for Messrs T. English and Company in Tullamore, in the same shop that my mother had worked in 30 years earlier. At the time, they had 2 shops, a restaurant and a bakery. I worked in the corner shop, as it was known, for 5 years. When it closed down, I moved to the bakery, where I began work as one of 3 van salesmen. One of the routes I covered twice a week included Clara, Ballycumber and Ferban, thereby passing the cross that had been erected where my Uncle Jack had been shot. I covered 4 different routes, taking in 11 D.E. Williams' shops, some still in the ownership of Messrs Williams and others taken over by their management and staff. In all the shops I was made feel very welcome, and more importantly, they became very good customers of mine, as most of the people involved would have known my Uncle Jack or would have heard of him. After a little over 2 years, Messrs English went out of business, and I started out my own as wholesale confectioner, making use of the many business contacts I'd made over the previous couple of years. I continued to pass the cross up to once a week up until the early 70s, when, due to business reasons, myself and my family moved to Bray, County Wicklow. We continued to travel down to Tullamore every weekend while my father and mother were still alive, and even after they passed away, to this day, we still keep in contact with many of our friends and relatives in the town. In August of 1984, I received a phone call from a reporter at the Midland Tribune in Tullamore. The phone call was regarding a 1915 Offaly Senior Football Championship medal that had been won by Jack Finley playing with Killy. The medal had been found by Christina Bracken at Kilmachlin, Clara. The reporter had been given my number by friends of mine from Tullamore who knew that my father came from Killy. He asked me was I related to Jack Finley, and I told him he was my uncle. We met in his office in Tullamore and he gave the medal to me. I kept this medal up safe, together with a medal that had been won by my Uncle Jack playing for Tullamore in 1919, and a medal that had been won by my father, Thomas Finlay, also playing for Tullamore in 1923. Here we are in the home of Carthage Minnock in Temple Oak, South County Dublin. Little did my grandfather realise that a phone call to Carthage would set forth a chain of events that would lead to the erection of a cross to Jack Finley in Ballycumber 9 months later. So Carthage, you and my granddad go back a long way, don't you?
Oh yeah, I grew up in Rahan, which is 6 miles or so from Tullamore. I was always involved in GA there, and of course I knew your grandfather from his association with Tullamore. He was playing hurling and football with Tullamore.
And so how long then since you had been last in contact?
Oh, it's 48 years since I last heard of your grandfather. I hadn't known anything about him until I got a phone call from him one day.
Were you surprised to get the phone call?
Indeed I was.
And what was the phone call about then?
The phone call was to ask me what knowledge I had of his uncle being shot in Leabeg, Ballycumber, in 1923. He had been informed that I had information about, he had made contact with the Offaly Historical Society and they referred him to me, and that's how he came to ring me.
And how did you become interested in Jack Finlay's story?
Well, I was interested in Jack Finley since I was about 4 years of age. My mother comes from Lemanaghan, which is the next town's land to Leabeg, where Jack Finley was shot. And as a child, we would go to Lemanaghan at least twice a year in horse and trap. And as we passed the monument to Jack Finley, my father told us the story and told it to us repeatedly. And my father was a member of the old IRA and would have a lot of sympathy for Jack Finley. I don't know whether he knew him or not, but he knew of Jack Finley being a former member of the old IRA. And that, what you hear when you're 4 or 5 years of age, you never forget. Mm. And the cross was most peculiar. Number one, it was the first great roadside memorial I ever saw. Number two, as a cross, it was most unusual because the 2 arms of the cross had a band going round the 2 arms. they were joined by a circular band of steel or iron.
And so how often did you go down to Ballycumber, and did you hear any other stories when you were there?
Yeah, well, I'd have gone twice a year until I was about 7 or 8 years of age, and indeed I used to spend my holidays in Lemanaghan. As a child, I would go for a few weeks in the summer. This entailed passing by Jack Finley's cross, and I never passed without thinking of the man. And indeed, my mother used to tell the story about shortly after she got married, herself and her father, my father, her husband, were visiting in Lemanaghan. On their way back, it was pitch dark, and they were cycling along. As they passed the cross, they heard a moan, or a number of moans, coming from the direction of the cross. My mother was frightened. However, my father was the type of man who had to investigate everything. And he got down off his bicycle, went back, and he found a drunken man sitting head forward with his back against the cross. And that explained the moaning that was heard. Nothing more sinister.
And did you know that my grandfather and Jack Finley were related at the time? Did you make that connection?
No, I didn't know your grandfather. All I knew about Jack Finley was that he had worked for Williams's. I had the full story as a child about he was bringing a horse and a container behind it, carrying mainly whiskey and porter at the time he was shot.
And what led you then in later years to come back to the story that you heard in your childhood?
Well, as I say, what you hear when you're 4 or 5 years of age, you never forget. And some years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, I had access to the Irish Times archives. And in those archives, they go back to 1857 or 58. And if you put in a name or a word, it will, any place that appears in the Irish Times, it'll come up. And I put in Jack Finley into it, and it's the first thing I ever checked in that Irish Times archives. It came up, and of course I became greatly interested in it, and I followed the entire story, and I copied each day's reference to him, first when he was shot originally, and then as it went on about men being charged and about what happened to them, and the fact that one of them was sentenced to death, appealed, lost his appeal, and was at the night, I think it's the night before his execution, or certainly very shortly before that, he was reprieved.
And did these stories that you picked up from the newspapers, did they chime with what you'd heard when you were younger?
They filled in exactly what I had heard. They fitted in perfectly with what my father had told me. He'd have been very familiar with the entire matter.
So Carthage, you've amassed a collection of newspaper clippings from this court case, haven't you?
Yes, I collected everything that appeared in the Irish Times in connection with the trial, the arrest and the trial, from the appearance on the 14th of February in court in 1923, right up to when reprieve was granted on the 18th of February 1926.
And in that time you were looking through these newspaper records, you also came across a sporting connection between your own family.
Yes, I was looking up a totally separate matter a short time later. I was looking up, I was following the football career of my father's first cousin, Pat Minnock. And Pat Minnock played in 30th of September 1922, he played for Offaly in Croke Park against Wicklow. And here I discovered that Jack Finley was playing at centre field on the same team as Pat Minnock. It was a game, by the way, lost by Offaly. Wicklow won 2-4 to 2-2.
And were you surprised by this one again? I mean, it's another series of coincidences.
Yeah, this came as a surprise to me. I didn't know. I did know that Jack Finley played football, but I thought he only had played at club level until I found this where he was playing for Offaly, as I say. It was my father's first cousin I was looking up. It wasn't Jack Finlay, but I was delighted to find it. And that was only 4 months before he was actually shot. He was